When I was a child, we would often stop at my great-grandmother's house for a visit. Now, a tiny bit of background about my great-grandmother. She survived the Armenian genocide, and her entire family was killed, and she came to the U.S. as the bride of an Armenian living here in the United States. So that's my great-grandmother. So growing up, we lived down the street from her, and we called her Little Graham because she was about 4'8". And so we just sort of affectionately referred to her as the Little Graham. And she embodied hospitality in all that she was. Through and through, she was one of the most hospitable, generous women. So when we went to visit Little Graham, my mother would remind us as we were driving there that we were going to eat whatever Little Graham served. Whether we were hungry or not, that we were going to enjoy whatever she put out. We might not be hungry, we might not like what she was giving us, but she would feed us nonetheless, because she remembered a time when there wasn't enough food. She knew of a time when there was so much fear and grief that she could not even imagine a safe environment in which family might stop by for a visit. So my brother and I tried to do as we were told. And we would eat what Little Graham served us. And as we would drive there, we would hope against hope that she would not serve us cold soup or stale cookies. But if cold soup and stale cookies was what we got, we gamely put on our smile and tasted what Little Graham served us. God showed Peter a way to accept hospitality also, much like my mom instilled in us. Peter spent many days at Cornelius' house. And Cornelius was not a Jew like Peter was. And so he did not observe the same dietary rules. But Peter ate with him nonetheless. So what we just heard Jane tell us was actually sort of a retelling of what originally happened in the chapter before. And we hear that God said to Peter, Peter says, God has shown me a different way. So God showed Peter that it was not his job to decide what was clean and unclean to eat, that God showed him a way to break down the division and to share a table with someone who in those days was considered completely other and different. Now, this story is not entirely about being forced to eat what we don't want to eat. Instead, we are reminded in this story that our God shows us another way. God shows us unity when we attempt to live in division. God shows us acceptance when we attempt to live in judgment. From this story, we see that the Gentile Cornelius does indeed become a follower of Jesus, and he and his entire household are baptized. But more important than that part of the story, the folks who are challenging Peter, those who are questioning what Peter did, they are changed through this story. And Peter himself is changed. So how? How does this change happen? Now, it's not magic. The story tells us that prayer and storytelling help bring about this change. So last week, as we remember Tabitha, the same sort of scene is happening where Peter is praying. Now, the words of this prayer today that Peter is praying do not magically erase the division that exists between Peter and Cornelius and his house. But there's kind of that cheesy saying that prayer changes things and prayer changes us. That's kind of true. That through prayer, Peter is changed. Peter realizes that God is saying, there's a different way. When we spend time with God, be it on our knees talking to God, or walking and listening to birds sing, or sitting quietly staring out a window, our hearts become open to God showing us something new. Now, you might not see strange visions like Peter had, that dream with the sheet and the different animals and all that stuff. You might, but more often than not, something quiet will settle into us when we are open in prayer. It might be someone you've not talked to in ages, and God has shown you that you ought to reach out to that person. It might be that you have sort of a tugging into action about an issue that you care about, and God is showing you to get involved. It might be that you encounter utter silence, and God is whispering, keep paying attention. It might be like the Grinch who stole Christmas, that God might nudge your heart to grow several sizes, somehow encompassing people that you had not had in your heart before. So that saying that prayer changes us, it's not wrong. We might indeed start out praying that God might change the other person, but more often in the midst of that prayer, God shows us that we need to change. God shows us that we need to be opened. God shows us that we need to welcome. God shows us that we need to live and be in our world. So through this story, we see that Peter is changed through his praying, but that's not the end of the changing. Peter's storytelling about his vision helps others to change as well. Those who were complaining that Peter had eaten things he shouldn't have eaten and shared a meal with people he shouldn't have shared a meal with, Peter tells them the story. And they end up praising God after hearing that story. Friends, prayer and storytelling, God uses prayer and storytelling, but it's God who is doing the changing in us and in others. We just need to be open to listening, and we also need to be open to telling our stories about how God has moved in and among us. God does the rest of it. God will show us how we need to change and grow, how perhaps we need more seats at our tables and less fences of division. How God might be moving in the hearts and the minds of those around us. That story I told you earlier about my mom and my little Graham, well, that lesson of hospitality lived on. Years later, I was chaperoning a youth trip to New York City. And I took this group of youth to 2nd Avenue Deli, a famous Jewish deli in Manhattan. And we got there, and there was a really long line, so we put our name on the list, and we were outside waiting. Somehow, the manager got word of who we were, that we were on a youth mission trip, and what we were doing, and came out and greeted us. And he said, Just hang on, I'll be right back with something for you to enjoy while you wait. He left, and I turned and I looked every single one of those kids in the eye, and I gave them the lesson my mother taught me, and I said, whatever he brings out, you will accept graciously, you will try it, and you will say thank you. And only one of you gets an out if he shows up with anything of meat, because the rest of you had pepperoni pizza last night. Out he came with a big platter of liver pate. And you could see the looks on these kids' faces, and it was such a good little moment we shared before that pate came out. And every last one of them said thank you, with that little piece of bread, with that pate smeared on it, gamefully ate that pate. Some of them even asked for seconds, but every single one of them graciously said thank you, including the one who was vegan, who didn't partake of it. Now, that is a silly story of hospitality showing. But there's ways that these stories live and move to remind us how we need to be open, to help break down the divisions that divide us, that probably don't even exist. But when we get to know one another, those divisions do come down. Friends, our God shows us where we need to be open, where we need to grow, where we need to widen our hospitality and our love through prayer, through storytelling. So I want to invite you now to a moment of prayer. You can close your eyes, you can gaze somewhere so you can kind of just let these words paint a picture in your heart and mind. So whatever it is you need to do to allow these words to paint a picture for you. Let us be in a moment of prayer. The house of God is our home, a place of comfort, familiarity, of easily held opinions, common causes, and shared values. The house of God is a community that affirms our beliefs, traditions, and understandings of the world. Our God came to live among us and broke through every barrier of sense, wisdom, and experience to forge a new people, to build a new community without borders or boundaries. And into our quiet complacency or our noisy division, God, you suggest another way. Break down our barriers, crash through our comfort zones, so that we might see what it is to live in your way. So we pause, God, and we ponder the inclusion we feel. The exclusion we sometimes create. The easy friendships, the like-minded gatherings, and the many left outside. God, we envision what might seem unclean and remember that to you it is precious. God, we consider what looks ungodly and remember that to you it is worthy. Sinners made saints, outsiders pulled into the warmth at the hearth, the walls of the community, the walls of this very church, push them out to make room. And God, we ask that you might forgive us when our narrow-mindedness causes us to exclude. Forgive us when we have a tendency to disapprove and judge. Open our hearts and our arms to the life you have promised. Open our doors to make room for those that you would welcome. For we remember, God, that although we wander from the path, although we step out of the light, although we embroider the truth, although we deny the fullness of life, despite all of this, Christ comes bearing life, light, truth, and new life for us all, and we are made whole. Thanks be to God. Amen. Friends, may that be so. May our hearts grow 3 sizes. May our tables have more seats, so that indeed through our prayers and through our storytelling, God might change us. Amen.